My name is Alicia Swery, and I'm 32 years old. I used to think that being patient was the same thing as being strong, and that loving someone meant learning how to swallow discomfort quietly enough that no one else had to notice. The party was already past its peak when I realized something in me had finally given out. The bass from the speakers vibrated through the floor, loud and stupid like a heartbeat that refused to acknowledge the night was dying. I stood near the kitchen island with a warm drink in my hand, watching my boyfriend Lucas Reed laugh across the room. And standing, or rather seated right beside him, was Maya Collins. Maya was his ex-girlfriend. Not officially, of course. Officially, she was one of his closest friends. The kind of ex you were told not to worry about because they were ancient history. The kind who still knew exactly how he took his coffee, what jokes would make him laugh, and how to lean just a little too close without anyone calling it inappropriate. For 3 years, Maya had existed like a footnote in our relationship, a constant presence explained away with practiced ease. She texted him late at night. She showed up at gatherings uninvited but somehow expected. She hugged him too long. I brought it up carefully, always gently, always framed as my own discomfort instead of his behavior. "Sometimes it just makes me uneasy," I'd said once. "You're overthinking," Lucas replied. "She's basically family. Family doesn't sit on your lap." I watched as Maya laughed at something Lucas said, and with a movement that was far too intentional to be accidental, turned and settled sideways onto his thighs. Not a stumble, not a joke, a decision. His hands didn't hesitate. They rested comfortably at her waist, thumbs tracing small circles against the fabric of her dress, like muscle memory hadn't forgotten where they belonged. Something cold closed around my chest. I crossed the room, the noise narrowing until everything felt tunneled and distant. When I spoke, my voice surprised me with its calm. "Lucas," I said, "can we talk for a second?" He turned already annoyed. "Alicia, not this again." The way he said it loud enough for the people around us to hear made it clear I was being cast as a problem before I'd even spoken. I gestured lightly toward them, toward the image he was pretending didn't exist. "This," I said, "this is a bit much." Maya rolled her eyes before Lucas could respond, as if this were a performance she'd rehearsed. She glanced at the others, not at me. "See? This is what I deal with," she said, taking a drink. "If you can't handle his friendships, that's your issue." Lucas nodded along. "You're being insecure." Maya smiled at him, satisfied, and leaned back more comfortably against his chest. And suddenly the anxiety that had lived inside me for years, the constant measuring of tone, the rehearsing of conversations, the fear of being labeled controlling just evaporated. There was no anger, no heartbreak, just clarity. I looked directly at Lucas. I didn't acknowledge Maya at all. "You're right," I said. His expression softened, triumphant. "Finally. It is my problem," I continued. "And I've decided I don't want it anymore." The smile slipped from his face. "What does that mean?" But I was already turning away. The conversation had ended before he realized it. I walked toward the makeshift bar in the dining room, my steps lighter than they had been in years. The sick weight was gone, replaced by something hollow and clean. At the bar, a man was talking at a woman who was nodding politely, eyes scanning the room for rescue. I slid into the empty space beside her. "Whiskey," I told the bartender. "Neat. And another Cabernet for her." The man talking blinked irritated. The woman turned toward me, startled, then relieved. "Looked like you could use backup," I said, offering a small smile. She laughed. A real laugh. Was it that obvious? Blockchain explanations usually are. She clinked her glass against mine. "I'm Daniel, and you might have just saved my night." Across the room, I felt the shift before I saw it. Lucas stood up. Maya slid off his lap. Anger radiated toward me. "What are you doing?" he hissed when he reached us. I looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing. "Making new friends," I said calmly. "You inspired me." His confusion was almost painful to watch. I turned back to Daniel. "This party's dead. Want to get a real drink somewhere quieter?" Daniel smiled. "Absolutely." I didn't look back as we walked out. I didn't need to. Outside, the cool night air felt like baptism. I muted Lucas's notifications before I even reached the sidewalk. I walked away and I never once looked back. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in the way fog does, soft, at first, almost polite, until I realized I was standing in the middle of it, surrounded on all sides by something that used to be noise. The first night after the party, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone face down on the nightstand like a sleeping animal I didn't trust anymore. My body kept expecting it to buzz. Muscle memory is a cruel thing. For 3 years, my nervous system had been trained to anticipate Lucas, his late night texts, his explanations, his casual reassurances that somehow always left me feeling smaller. Every few minutes, my hand twitched toward the phone before my mind caught up and reminded me, you chose this. Morning was worse. I woke up reaching for him, or at least for the version of him that used to send a good morning message with a dumb emoji and a half-formed plan for the weekend. Instead, there was nothing. No apology, no confusion, no attempt to explain what sitting on another woman's lap meant in a relationship that was supposedly secure. The silence sat on my chest, like weight not crushing but constant. It wasn't grief in the dramatic sense. It was more like losing a limb you hadn't realized was already numb. I didn't block him. Blocking would have meant engagement a line drawn in red. This was quieter. I muted his notifications, then deleted his number altogether. I archived our photos into a cloud folder. I named something neutral and forgettable, as if I were packing up an old apartment rather than dismantling a future I'd once imagined. I wasn't trying to erase what we'd had. I was just removing it from my daily line of sight the way you put winter coats away when the season changes. On the third day, my friend Rachel Monroe let herself into my apartment without knocking, holding a paper bag full of groceries and a look that was half concern, half assessment. She took one glance at me and nodded. "You look terrible," she said, "but steady." "I feel hollow," I admitted, accepting the coffee she handed me. "But the hollow is quiet. It's not full of negotiations anymore." Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table, elbows planted, studying my face. "Let me guess. No more asking yourself if you're being unreasonable. No more wondering how to phrase things so he wouldn't get defensive," I said. "No more explaining why basic respect matters." She exhaled slowly. "That's not insecurity, Alicia. That's exhaustion." The word landed cleanly. Exhaustion. I hadn't been dramatic. I'd been tired. That afternoon, I started cleaning. Not in a frantic way, not the kind that comes with rage or heartbreak, but methodically. I gathered his forgotten sweatshirt from the back of the closet, the spare toothbrush from the cup by the sink, the charger he'd always claimed was his but never took. I put everything into a box and slid it under the bed, out of sight, not out of existence. I rearranged the furniture, not because it needed to be moved, but because I did. Changing the physical geography of my space felt like reclaiming territory I hadn't realized I'd surrendered, inch by inch. At night, the quiet was loud. Thoughts surfaced that I'd spent years pushing down. All the moments I'd felt uneasy and talked myself out of it. All the times I'd accepted explanations that didn't quite fit because challenging them felt like too much work. I realized how much energy I'd been pouring into maintaining the image of being the chill girlfriend, the one who didn't ask for reassurance, who didn't need boundaries, who trusted automatically. It wasn't strength. It was self-erasure disguised as maturity. A week later, I ran into Daniel again. It wasn't planned. I was picking up takeout from a small place near my apartment when I heard my name spoken cautiously, like someone testing whether it still belonged to them. He smiled when he saw me. No surprise, no expectation. "Hey," he said, "no party music this time." We ate together that night, talking about nothing important and everything easy. The kind of conversation that didn't require monitoring tone or meaning. There was no undercurrent, no emotional math. When he asked how I was doing, it wasn't loaded. When I answered honestly, it wasn't punished. It struck me how rare that had become. Later alone again, I realized something that made me pause in the middle of my living room. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was clean. Spacious. It left room for my own thoughts to exist without being immediately reframed or dismissed. I went to bed that night without checking my phone once, and for the first time in a long time, I slept all the way through. Once the silence stopped feeling like an absence, it began to feel like a resource. Time stretched differently when it wasn't being sliced into pieces by explanations, reassurances, and second-guessing. Mornings were no longer dictated by whether Lucas had texted, whether his tone meant something had shifted overnight, or whether I needed to prepare myself emotionally for another conversation that would end with me apologizing for having feelings. The quiet didn't fix me overnight, but it gave me something I hadn't had in years, uninterrupted space to notice myself. I started with my body not out of spite or revenge, but because it was the part of me that had been carrying the most unspoken tension. The gym became a place where effort translated directly into result. No emotional decoding, no reading between lines. Lift the weight, feel the burn, count the reps. Progress was measurable, honest. Each small increase felt like reclaiming a fraction of myself that had been diverted elsewhere. I wasn't trying to become someone new. I was trying to return to the version of me that existed before every feeling had to be justified. Then I moved on to my routines. Weekends had once revolved around Lucas's plans, his brunch spots, his friends' gatherings, his tolerance for my interests. Somewhere along the way, my hobbies had become optional add-ons instead of anchors. I dug my sketching supplies out of the hall closet, the ones I'd stopped using because they took up space on the dining table. I set them up again unapologetically, letting charcoal dust smudge my fingers as I relearned the pleasure of being absorbed in something that didn't involve anyone else's approval. Rachel noticed the shift before I fully did. "You're not bracing anymore," she said one afternoon as we walked through the park. "You used to walk like you were waiting for someone to tap you on the shoulder and tell you you'd done something wrong." That observation lingered with me. I realized how much of my posture, literal and emotional, had been shaped by anticipation. Anticipation of dismissal, of conflict, of having to explain myself. Daniel drifted back into my life slowly with none of the urgency that used to define my relationships. We went for coffee, then dinner, then long walks where conversation meandered without purpose. He didn't demand access to my history or frame my boundaries as challenges. He didn't flinch when I said I was taking things slow. If anything, he seemed relieved by it. I liked the calm he admitted once, almost sheepish. "It feels adult." That word made me smile. Adult. Not dramatic, not performative, just grounded. It wasn't lost on me how different this felt from the intensity I'd once mistaken for passion. With Lucas, everything had felt high stakes, like a test I was always studying for but never quite passing. With Daniel, there was no test, just presence. Around the same time, fragments of news about Lucas began to filter back to me, uninvited but inevitable. Mutual friends mentioned him in passing, their tones shifting awkwardly when they realized I no longer reacted. He and Maya were inseparable now, apparently. Loudly affectionate, publicly intense, the kind of coupling that demanded to be seen. I felt a flicker of recognition, not jealousy. It was the same pattern I'd lived inside, just louder now, less subtle. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The life I was building didn't have space for secondhand chaos. One evening, as I rearranged the shelves in my living room, I noticed the box under the bed, the one with Lucas's things. For a moment I considered opening it. Then I didn't. I slid it farther back instead, not with anger, but with certainty. Some chapters don't need rereading to be closed. I stood in the center of my apartment afterward, the windows open, air moving freely through rooms that finally felt like mine. I wasn't healed, not completely, but I was anchored. And for the first time since that night at the party, the future didn't feel like something I had to defend myself against. It felt like something I was allowed to step into. I didn't go looking for news about Lucas. I didn't need to. Information has a way of finding you when you're connected to the same social ecosystem long enough, especially when a story starts to unravel loudly. At first it came in offhand comments delivered with the careful neutrality people use when they're not sure what version of you they're speaking to anymore. Rachel was the first to mention it casually, as if discussing the weather. "I ran into Maya at the wine bar downtown," she said, stirring her drink. She looked tense. I didn't ask for elaboration. Rachel, sensing that, continued anyway. Lucas was there too. He was holding court, talking over everyone. Maya barely said a word. The image landed with a strange familiarity. I'd lived in that silence once, the silence of shrinking yourself to make room for someone else's presence. I felt no rush of vindication, no secret pleasure, just recognition. The control Lucas had always denied, wanting the control he'd accused me of imagining, was suddenly visible now that it had nowhere to hide. More details surfaced in fragments over the following weeks. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Lucas had effectively moved into Maya's apartment almost immediately. Another let slip that they argued in public more than anyone was comfortable witnessing. Their dynamic, once framed as playful and misunderstood, was becoming something sharper, more exposed. The most telling update came one afternoon when Rachel called me, her voice unusually serious. "This isn't gossip anymore," she said. "It's getting bad." She told me Lucas had taken Maya's car without asking and wrapped it around a street sign. He hadn't been hurt. Maya hadn't been with him. The damage, however, was extensive. No insurance, no apology that stuck. Just a familiar refrain. It wasn't a big deal. She was overreacting. She needed to chill. I closed my eyes as she spoke, not because it hurt, but because it clarified something I hadn't fully articulated yet. This wasn't a new version of Lucas. This was the unfiltered one, the version that emerged when no one bothered to manage his image anymore. Rachel hesitated before adding, apparently he mocked her for being stressed about the repair costs, called her high maintenance, a burden. The words were like a mirror, held up to a past I'd narrowly escaped. I could picture the scene vividly. Maya's frustration dismissed her anxiety, reframed as weakness, her needs reduced to inconveniences. It was the same language he'd once used with me, just applied more openly now that there was no incentive to soften it. I felt something then, but it wasn't sympathy. It was distance. Emotional, psychological, almost geographical. Like watching a storm from a place already cleared and reinforced. That night, as I worked on a sketch at my dining table, I realized how close I'd come to staying. How easily I might have rationalized that party that moment the way I'd rationalized so many others before it. If I hadn't walked away when I did, this chaos wouldn't be theoretical. It would be my reality. Daniel noticed my quiet and asked gently, "You okay?" I nodded, just grateful. For what? For leaving when I still recognized myself. He didn't press, he didn't need to. He just reached for my hand, not possessively, not performatively, but like it was the most natural thing in the world. As more stories filtered in arguments at gatherings, tense silences, friends quietly withdrawing, I felt an odd sense of closure settle in. The life I'd stepped out of was collapsing under the weight of its own denial, and for the first time I understood that walking away hadn't been abandonment. It had been survival. The first message came from an unknown number late on a Tuesday night. I was on my couch legs tucked beneath me, a book open but unread in my lap when my phone lit up. For a moment my heart responded before my mind did a reflex I hadn't quite trained out of myself yet. Then I read the words. "Alicia, we need to talk. It's important." There was no signature, but I recognized the cadence immediately. Lucas had always written like his urgency should automatically become mine. I stared at the screen long enough for the words to lose their edges, then I deleted the message. No reply, no explanation, just removal. 2 days later, another unknown number. "I'm sorry about the party. That was messed up. I shouldn't have said what I said. Can we just talk?" The phrasing was familiar in a way that made my jaw tighten. That was messed up, passive, detached. Not "I hurt you," but something unfortunate happened. I deleted it too. The act was becoming easier, less charged, like brushing crumbs off a counter. By the third message, I was no longer surprised. "Maya is out of the picture. It was a mistake, a huge one. I should have listened to you. Please, Alicia." I read that one twice, not because it tempted me, but because it revealed something I'd finally learned how to see clearly. He wasn't reaching out because he understood what he'd done. He was reaching out because the situation that once fed his ego was now costing him something. Peace. Stability, control. I mentioned the messages to Rachel over lunch more as an observation than a confession. "He's realizing there's a price tag," she said bluntly, "and you're the refund he thinks he's entitled to." That framing stuck with me. I wasn't a person in his narrative anymore. I was a safety net he'd assumed would still be there folded neatly where he'd left it. The next attempt didn't come from him directly. It came from Sarah Blake, a mutual friend who had always positioned herself as neutral, but had quietly benefited from the stability I'd brought to Lucas's life. Her call went to voicemail while I was at the gym, headphones, in body fully engaged in the clean burn of effort. I listened to it afterward, hands steady breath, still elevated. Alicia Sarah's voice began soft with practiced concern. "I know things ended badly, and I know he messed up, but he's really struggling. Maya treated him terribly. He feels used. He just needs to explain himself to you. You were always so understanding. Can't you at least hear him out? Be the bigger person, unspoken but loud." I sat on the bench for a moment, letting the familiar weight of that expectation settle and then slide off. When I called her back, my voice was polite, almost warm. "I appreciate you reaching out," I said, "but Lucas and I don't have anything to discuss. I hope he's okay, but his well-being isn't my responsibility anymore. Please don't contact me about this again." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the sound of someone recalculating a strategy that had always worked before. "So you're just abandoning him?" Sarah asked, the softness giving way to accusation. "After everything, I'm choosing myself," I replied evenly. "Goodbye, Sarah." I ended the call and blocked the number, It was the first time I'd done that. It felt less like aggression and more like maintenance, the emotional equivalent of locking a door before a storm. That night, I realized something subtle but profound. The messages, the calls, the appeals to my empathy, they no longer stirred anything in me. No guilt, no longing, just clarity. Whatever Lucas was losing now, it wasn't me. It was the illusion that I would always be there to absorb the consequences of his choices. The final attempt came on a Sunday morning, the kind of morning that used to belong to Lucas and me by default. Late light filtered through the curtains, warming the living room in soft gold, and I was moving slowly, deliberately, enjoying the luxury of an unclaimed day. Coffee brewed on the counter. The apartment smelled faintly of clean linen and the lemon soap I'd started using simply because I liked it, not because anyone else did. My phone vibrated once on the table. Unknown number. I didn't pick it up. I already knew better. I let it ring out, finished pouring my coffee, and sat down before checking the notification. A voicemail. 3 minutes long. The maximum. I listened. Lucas's voice sounded wrong the moment it came through the speaker. Not angry, not defensive, stripped. Raw in a way I'd never heard before, as if the tone he usually used to manage conversations had finally collapsed under its own weight. "Alicia, it's me," he said. Unnecessary clarification trembling in his breath. I don't know who else to call. There it was. Not "I hurt you," not "I'm sorry," just need unfiltered and panicked. "He's gone," Lucas continued. "Maya's gone. She just packed up and left. Took some of my stuff. I think she took my laptop too. And the cash I had. I don't know. Everything just fell apart." I sat very still, coffee cooling in my hands, listening without interruption. He talked about being laughed at, ignored, about friends who had stopped answering his calls, about being alone in an apartment that no longer felt like his. The words spilled out in uneven waves, desperation replacing confidence, entitlement, eroded by fear. "You were always my rock," he said finally, his voice breaking on the word. "You were my home. I made a terrible mistake. I know that now. Please, just call me back. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll change. I'll never talk to another woman again. I just need you. I'm so alone." The message cut off abruptly when it hit its time limit. For a long moment, I did nothing. No surge of triumph, no flicker of vindication, just a vast, neutral stillness inside me, like standing at the edge of a quiet lake with no urge to step in. I understood something then with startling clarity. His suffering was real, but it wasn't mine. It belonged entirely to the life he had chosen, the choices he had defended, the dismissals he had doubled down on. I hadn't caused his loneliness. I'd simply stopped protecting him from it. I deleted the voicemail. Not angrily, not ceremoniously, just as you'd clear a notification that no longer required action. I placed my phone face down on the table and took a sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm. Outside, a car passed. Somewhere down the block, someone laughed. Life continued steady and indifferent to emotional implosions that no longer belonged to me. The quiet that followed wasn't hollow anymore. It was full of morning light, of completed decisions, of a future that didn't require me to be anyone's emotional shelter. Whatever Lucas had lost, it wasn't me. It was access. The city has a way of staging its own conclusions when you're not looking for them. I didn't plan to see Lucas again. I hadn't rehearsed what I would say if I did. In my mind, that chapter was already closed, filed away, under decisions that didn't need revisiting. But life rarely asks permission before reminding you where you've been. It was a Saturday morning at the farmer's market downtown, the kind of morning that feels intentionally alive. The air smelled like fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, and the crowd moved with an easy rhythm, people lingering instead of rushing. I was there with Daniel, our fingers loosely intertwined as we wandered from stall to stall, debating cheeses with the exaggerated seriousness of people who had nowhere else they needed to be. He was telling me a story about a client who had insisted on impossible design changes, and I was laughing genuinely, laughing, the sound unforced and unguarded. That was when I saw Lucas. He stood near a produce stand holding a bundle of carrots he didn't seem to be seeing. His posture was wrong. Shoulders slightly collapsed, as if gravity had increased without warning. His clothes looked rumpled, not in a charming, careless way, but in the way of someone who'd stopped paying attention to small things. The sharp confidence he used to wear so easily was gone, replaced by something brittle and exposed. I felt it before he looked up, that subtle awareness of being watched. When our eyes met, the change in his expression was immediate and raw. Shock first, then hope, desperate and unfiltered, like a person spotting land after weeks adrift. His gaze flicked to Daniel, to our joined hands, and the hope curdled into something darker, something wounded and accusing. He walked toward us slowly, as if each step required negotiation with his pride. Alicia, he said my name, sounding unfamiliar in his mouth stripped of ownership. I didn't know you'd be here. I come most weekends, I replied calmly. My voice surprised me with its neutrality. Polite, distant, the tone you use with someone you vaguely recognize from another department. He swallowed. You look good. Thanks. The pause stretched awkward and heavy. Daniel didn't let go of my hand. He didn't squeeze it either. He simply stayed present and steady, a quiet statement in himself. Can we talk? Lucas blurted. Just for a few minutes. Please. I've been through hell, Alicia. You don't understand. I tilted my head slightly, not in dismissal but in acknowledgement. There's nothing to talk about. The finality in my voice cracked something in him. His expression hardened, the old entitlement flashing through like muscle memory. So that's it, he hissed, lowering his voice. After everything, you just replace me and move on like none of it mattered. You don't even care what Maya did to me, what she took. I looked at Daniel, then really looked. There was no jealousy in his eyes, no insecurity, no silent demand that I perform loyalty. Just trust. Partnership. The difference was so stark, it almost hurt. I turned back to Lucas. I care about the life I'm building now, I said evenly. The past isn't part of that. I genuinely wish you well, but we're done. I didn't wait for a response. I turned to Daniel, already closing the file in my mind. Ready. The cheese stall with the sharp cheddar is about to pack up. He smiled. Absolutely. As we walked away, I felt Lucas standing behind us, frozen, in a moment he no longer had access to. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some endings don't require witnesses. We blended back into the crowd. Sunlight warming my face. Daniel's hand steady in mine. The market noise swallowed everything else, and for the first time, the memory of Lucas felt distant, not painful, not charged, just irrelevant. We didn't rush after that. Daniel and I moved through the market at the same unhurried pace we'd had before stopping to sample cheese, listening to a street musician tune his guitar, letting the morning unfold without commentary. The encounter didn't linger between us like an unspoken question. It didn't need processing. It had already settled into its proper place behind me. As we sat on a low concrete ledge, sharing a paper tray of pastries, Daniel glanced over casual but attentive. You okay? I took a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. I scanned my internal landscape the way I'd learned to do over the past few months, checking for aftershocks. There was no tightness in my chest, no replaying of words, no urge to explain or justify anything I'd said. I'm really okay, I replied, and the truth of it felt almost quiet in its completeness. What surprised me most was the absence of triumph. I hadn't won anything. There was no sense of having come out on top, no dramatic closing line echoing in my head. Instead, there was a calm, grounded satisfaction, the kind that comes from alignment rather than validation. I had chosen myself consistently, and the world hadn't collapsed because of it. If anything, it had expanded. Later that afternoon, back in my apartment, I placed the cheese on the counter and leaned against it for a moment, letting the day settle. The space around me felt lived in but intentional, shaped by decisions made with clarity rather than compromise. The box under the bed was still there, but it no longer felt significant. It was just an object, not a threat, not a question. I realized then that the biggest shift hadn't been external at all. It wasn't Lucas's collapse or Maya's disappearance or even the ease of something new with Daniel. It was the fact that I no longer measured my worth by how much discomfort I could tolerate for love. I no longer mistook endurance for devotion. The silence I'd once feared had become my compass. It told me when something was wrong. It told me when something was right. It protected the version of me that didn't need to argue to exist. That night, as I set my phone on the table and turned out the lights, there were no unknown numbers waiting, no apologies demanding consideration, no emergencies that required my emotional labor. There was just the steady rhythm of a life that felt finally like it